Hi, welcome to History 3380 World Civilizations. This is Session 6, the first part of Session 6. In Session 5, what we're looking at is the rise of the trading empires, the beginnings of the early modern and modern world. And in that context, I had talked about issues such as climate change, the movement of nomadic peoples, their fusion essentially with sedentary groups. Out of that, the implementation of new technologies and the creation of empires that focused on the control of long-distance trading routes and were therefore able, through their economic resources, to expand in economic and military forms far beyond whatever had been achieved previous to that time. What we're going to do in Session 6 is look more at the effects of the trading empires. We've looked at how they got created. We looked at some of the structures, some of the competition. We want to see what the effects were of trading empires. And to do that, I'm going to focus on one in particular, and that is the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. And over the course of this part of the session and the next part, we're going to look at both the impact of the Spanish Empire on indigenous groups in the Western Hemisphere, the importance of the slave trade, and the importance of the vast shipments of wealth from the Americas that set off a price revolution in Europe and helped contribute to the rise of capitalism in the modern world. All of that related very directly to the rise of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. If we look at the first slide here, what refers to as the consummate new empire, it's because Spain incorporated in the Americas all these dramatic new aspects of imperial rule that were implied in the term trading empires. It controlled vast populations, probably 25 million people when the Spanish first came to the New World, and it created a fabulous trading system based on the export of silver from the Americas. In the process of creating this empire, which, as I suggested a minute ago, had wide-ranging global effects, it conquered this population of at least 25 million people, and as we will see, dramatically transformed them in terms of their own social structures, economic practices, and of course, cultural values. Not that they would totally change, as we well know, but they were dramatically affected by this process. We're also going to be looking at a particular part of the Spanish Empire, and that is the Caribbean, when we get to talking about the issue of trade, because most of Spain's trade with the New World flowed through the Caribbean Sea. And we will see the issues that arise as other trading empires contest for power in that region, and also the issue of smuggling as it affects the development of this vast trading network. And along the way, of course, as I just mentioned, we're going to see how the slave trade and the flow of silver out of the New World affected conditions in Africa and Europe, influencing in significant ways the history of both those regions. Now, we briefly visited the Americas previously when I was talking about the impact of pandemic disease on global history, and we looked at the Great Dying as it was known. Now we're going to go back and look a little more closely. We're going to talk a little bit about disease just because you can't not talk about it and discuss the history of the Americas. But more significantly, we're going to look at these indigenous populations, how they were structured socially and economically, and how they were affected by the coming of the Spanish. The movement of these peoples into this part of the world, as I mentioned, came in part from the changes in climate that we've seen affect peoples all around the world. Specifically, the Aztec, or as they're technically known, the Mexica, were nomadic peoples living along what we now call the Rio Grande Valley region. The changing climate helped move these peoples down into central Mexico to the area of a vast lake in the Central Valley of Mexico, where they created their capital, Tenochtitlan, which sat on the very site where modern Mexico City now rises. And from this location, they expanded out to dominate much of what is central Mexico today. An important part of that expansionary process was the close interconnection between religious beliefs and warfare in Mexica culture. One of the principal gods of the Aztecs of the Mexica was Huitzilopochtli. I know, easy for me to pronounce. Understanding the history of this god helps you grasp the critical significance of warfare for the Aztec. The story of Huitzilopochtli is that he was born of a goddess mother. While she was pregnant with Huitzilopochtli, two of his brothers became jealous of the fact that their mother was about to bear another child. And they attempted to murder their mother. Happy times, obviously, among the Mexica. What happened at the moment of the attempted assassination is that Huitzilopochtli sprang full-blown from his mother's womb and slayed his brothers, indicating a fairly aggressive type of cultural value among the Aztec, that warfare was seen as critical to this society. They had served essentially as mercenaries in the past, working for other settled societies in the Central Valley of Mexico. And now this close association that they saw between warfare and the society and the survival and flourishing of their own culture was critical as they began to impose their control over the region. So war becomes a central element in the culture of the Mexica. Another important aspect of that culture was human sacrifice. There is no question that among the peoples of the Americas, the Mexica were probably the ones who most regularly practiced human sacrifice. And the basic motivating factor behind this in terms of religious belief was that the sun god, who disappeared each evening in the western horizon, was subject to attack as it entered the dark underworld. In order to help the sun god survive and thereby their own culture, the Mexica offered food, sustenance, to the sun god in the form of human beings. But even with these sacrifices, the Mexica believe that ultimately the cosmic energy that drove their culture, their society, would become exhausted, and their society would collapse and be replaced by a new one. This was a strongly cyclical view of history and how it functioned. The flourishing of a culture, the sapping of its energy, and then its final destruction, only to be replaced by yet another. In some ways, this may have influenced the Mexica reaction to the coming of the Spanish. Scholars vary significantly in how they interpret this, the idea that there is this sense of inevitability on the part of the Mexica about the coming of the Spanish. This represents indeed the beginnings of their downfall. How influential it was, again, a matter of interpretation. What is not subject to interpretation is that, of course, the Spanish conqueror, Hernan Cortez, arrived in 1519 and sought to conquer the Mexica society, now ruled by their emperor Montezuma II. And here, a point that I touched on in an earlier lecture, is where disease came to play a role. When the Spanish enter Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and seek to reduce it to their control. They are set upon by the Aztecs and have to flee. An important point that can be brought up here about the escape that the Spanish achieved on what they term the Night of Sorrows, because they lost a few of their men, is that this small band of Spaniards, numbering no more than 200, was able to escape from a city whose population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. One of the critical reasons this happened is because the Aztec belief in warfare as a religious right, their ability to counter the Spanish and their decision to suddenly flee, was influenced to a significant degree by the fact that for the Aztecs to participate in warfare, they needed to engage in certain rituals and rites before they could undertake such a venture, which gave the Spanish an opportunity to flee before the Aztecs could organize themselves in that fashion. We also know that on the return of Cortes, he would succeed in subduing the Aztec capital, in part aided by the impact of disease, and we talked about that when we talked about pandemic disease, the influence probably of smallpox, which laid waste to a significant part of the capital's population, and also due to the fact that the Spanish were able to rally various subjugated peoples in the Central Valley. Other indigenous groups that had been subordinated to the Aztecs now joined the Spanish cause, and due to, as well, to the role of one such person, a woman named Malinche, who served not only as Cortes's translator, but as his cultural eyes, helping him to see and understand the world of indigenous America in ways that no European could have understood otherwise. All of these factors contribute to the Spanish conquest of the Aztec society. So too, further south, in the great Inca Empire that stretched along the Pacific coast of South America, we see a rapid subjugation of the population. Now, the Incas were in fact building their civilization on earlier indigenous cultures, such as the Nazca and the Chimu empires. It was the Inca Emperor Pachakuti who, in the 15th century, launched this massive expansion along the Andean range of South America to create this empire. So the empire is of relatively recent origin, as was that of the Aztecs, building on earlier civilizations. Here too, religion plays a critical role, as we've seen it play in other early societies. The veneration of natural objects called Huacas, the belief that promontories of stone, mountains, etc., had divine qualities in and of themselves. The veneration of earlier generations. This is what led to the mummification of the Inca emperors, as well as other people within the Inca hierarchy, strongly believing, as they did, that it was earlier generations that helped assure the prosperity of the empire. And so it was absolutely essential to venerate these groups. As for the emperors themselves, they saw their ancestors as divine beings, that the emperors were in fact one with the sun god. They claimed divinity and ruled as divine figures. So these are some of the key characteristics of these Amerindian civilizations, these indigenous populations in the Americas, that the Spanish are in the process of conquering. Again, disease played a central role here in the conquest of the Incas. The death of the Emperor Huayna Capac in 1525, almost certainly the result, as I mentioned in the discussion on pandemics, of the spread of smallpox in advance of the Spanish themselves, as indigenous merchants, traders, spread the disease after contact with Spaniards, probably in the Caribbean. The death of the emperor led to a civil war between Atahualpa and Huascar, two sons of the emperor. Atahualpa had just defeated Huascar at the time of the arrival of the Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizzaro in 1532. After their encounter at Cajamarca, the Spanish take Atahualpa prisoner, hold him hostage for a ransom of gold, but when it's paid, they execute the emperor, this divinity who ruled over this vast empire stretching north to south in South America. So we have the rapid disintegration of both of these indigenous empires and the imposition of Spanish rule. Now, what were the keys to the ability of the Spanish to create what became a vast territorial empire? One was disease, which we've talked about. The fact that the populations of the Americas had lived for thousands of years in isolation from populations in Eurasia and Africa, had very little resistance, therefore, to the diseases brought by the Europeans. There were technological superiorities, which the Spanish enjoyed. The use of horses. There were no such beasts of burden anywhere in the Americas. And at least initially, they gave the Spanish an advantage until, after a few years, the local populations learned to adapt and adopt the horse. Something that we saw last time occurring all the way in the far reaches of North America with the Dakotas. But the Spanish also enjoyed advantages of metal weapons, swords, and the use of gunpowder fired weapons. These were some of the things that the Spanish brought. On the other side, as I mentioned in talking about Tenochtitlan, the fall of the Mexica capital, the worldview of the Mexica that divine activity and the events of the world around them are inextricably intertwined, and that they are very much part of that supernatural process that shapes the world, was also a disadvantage for these peoples as they tried to resist the Spanish. Now, as we know, as we've talked earlier in the course about various religions and Christianity, the Spanish still ascribed to the worldview that most people in the world did, and that was that most of what was seen, most of what occurred in the physical world was explicable through the actions of divine power. Nevertheless, while the Spanish would in fact pray to the Christian God to assist them in their battles, they did not believe that precise rites were necessary. They did not see warfare as a religious event. So they could be very practical in the way they approached it. If it's 3 o'clock in the morning and the enemy's sleeping, now's the time to attack. It doesn't make any difference. We don't have to engage in some type of religious rite. We don't have to wait for a special moment. It's what, practically speaking, serves our purposes. So that view, again, was an advantage over what indigenous peoples saw as the reality of the world. Another factor that plays a role was, of course, rebellious tribes that rose up against the Mexica, and to some degree, the Inca as well, who had been subordinated by these empires and now sought to resist the Inca and the Aztec, and allied themselves with the Spanish, believing that this would assure their own liberation. It was of course, a temporary liberation. This brings us to the point, with the next slide, of what did the Spanish create out of this world that they had conquered. First of all, the Spanish bring a system in which the institutions of the state and of religion are virtually inextricably intertwined. The monarchs of Spain worked hand in glove with the Christian church, and the Christian church cooperated fully in that process. For example, the appointments of bishops, the bureaucratic managers of the church, were actually made by the Spanish monarchy, by the Spanish king or queen, not by the Pope. This relationship was critical in the establishment of control by the Spanish, even with the demographic decline that we saw as a result of pandemic disease in the Americas. There were still millions of indigenous inhabitants in the New World, even when the demographic decline reached its worst point about 1650. By comparison, those who ruled over them, the Spaniards, numbered in the thousands. And the Spanish crown never kept more than a few thousand soldiers in an empire that stretched from Alaska, if you get it at its farthest reaches, all the way down to the southern tip of South America. How do you control such vast populations? Religion played an important role here. And we talked earlier in the course about how important religion can be, not only in challenging established beliefs, but also in terms of helping to create legitimacy for state rule. In this case, the Spaniards and the church undertook a massive campaign of conversion of the indigenous population, effectively bringing to Christianity the entire population of the New World. And the message of Christian preachers, of Catholic priests in the New World, was that the acceptance of Spanish rule was a part of God's plan for the inhabitants of the Americas. That the Spanish king or queen had been ordained by God to rule over these people, to bring them to Christianity, to bring them to salvation. That helped establish the legitimacy of Spanish rule. And at the same time, Christian conversion and education helped establish and maintain social control. Rarely in a society can you, for more than a few years, maintain control simply through the exercise of force. People have to accept the basic values and ideas of a society. And Christianity helped do that for the Spanish among the indigenous populations. Now, the entire population has essentially accepted Christianity. But it doesn't mean that they've necessarily accepted Christianity as it might be practiced in Europe. In fact, when we look at any religion of great dimensions, we find that people often adapt that religion to their own values, beliefs, and practices. And this certainly was true in the Americas, where conversion came so rapidly and came in such a drastic form, converting people from the belief in sun gods and the divinity of the Inca emperors to the message of Christianity, whose cultural roots, as we've seen, lie back in Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Here, there's a radical shift. So how did people respond? Yes, they converted, but at the same time, they retained many of their own beliefs. An important part of indigenous religious beliefs had to do with a plethora of divine figures. There was an earth mother figure, a rain god, etc. Divinities that controlled various aspects of the natural environment. Local populations tended to reinterpret the icons of Christianity so that they fulfilled those same roles. The Virgin Mary, for example, was usually interpreted to be the Earth Mother, the divine figure who brings the benefits of good harvests to mankind. There was what's referred to as religious syncretism, a merging, if you will, in the minds of the indigenous population of both their own fundamental values and those of Christianity. This often, of course, left the good friars and monks who were engaged in converting the populations absolutely scandalized, when they discovered that sacrifices were being made of small animals, etc., to the Virgin Mary, because they were hoping for a prosperous harvest in the year ahead. But eventually, actually, the Christian church came to accept many of these practices as a part of religious beliefs in the Western Hemisphere. So yes, there is this dramatic transformation in terms of the near total conversion of the population. But at the same time, what emerges is not a simply Europeanized, westernized population with their adoption of this religion. Instead, they have merged their own values with many of those of Christianity and created, in essence, a cultural hybrid. Something very similar can be seen and more complex in the worldview of the Incas. The view of the Incas prior to the coming of the Spanish was that there were essentially two realities. There was a divine reality and a natural world reality that overlapped and intersected at certain points, such as the divinity of the emperors. With the coming of the Spanish were simply seen as a third reality. So the Incas had a very complex view of the world, that there were really three spheres of reality that overlapped with one another, intersected at certain points, all of them operating by, shall we say, certain rules and values, partially affecting each other, but partially operating independently of each other. And the Incas saw themselves living in that kind of world, in a world that is partially affected by their own divinities, partly affected by the world of the Spanish, including Christianity, and partly, essentially, their own core values. So this is a highly complex vision of the world and how it functions that persisted down through the centuries in the Andean regions of South America. So yes, we get conversion, we get certainly the imposition of a whole set of cultural values and ideas, but at the same time, many of the existing ideas survive. As one anthropologist said, cultures don't interact like billiard balls. They don't simply strike each other and affect each other in one specific way. They tend to interact and merge in very complex ways, and that's what happened with the Spanish and the Amerindian populations. Another area where interaction had to occur had to do with social formations. And if we look at the next slide, we'll see how that occurs. We talked earlier in the course about social organization, including kinship. And kinship, as we saw, was critical in much of the world, essentially extended families, and how kinship was used to achieve many of the basic goals, many of the basic activities that occur in society, calling upon extended family relationships, responsibilities, in order to carry out the functions of, let's say, a village, to carry out economic activities, etc. that was certainly true among the populations of the Western Hemisphere. After all, the Mexica or the Aztec, the Inca could be described, and they were essentially tribal organizations. They fell into this type of kinship relationship. And that functioned very basically all the way down to the peasant village level. The Spanish quickly discovered that in order to access the labor of the indigenous population, they were going to have to work through those kinship relations. Remember, the Europeans, the Spanish, do not come from societies based on extended kinship formations. Theirs is a much more individualized culture and social formation. Now they have to try to deal with this kind of formation. As a result, they access labor through kinship leaders. It is not a matter of the Spanish simply dictating to indigenous populations that they're going to work the land, work in mines. They have to turn towards the kin leaders, the extended family, the community leaders, in order to access that labor. Because people will engage in that labor based on the idea that they are working for the benefit of the larger community. Now, initially, that system is carried out for the Spanish using their particular economic model, something called Encomienda. This is a model, and we've seen variations of this in other empires, by the way. It's essentially a way of collecting tribute and of rewarding people who conquer populations. We saw this with the Ottomans, for example. In this case, the Spanish had used Encomienda as a way of reconquering the Iberian Peninsula. A grant of the right to use the labor of a village, a valley, a region, given to the Spanish prince, military leader, whatever, who actually engaged in the conquest. Well, the same mechanism is used in the New World. The Spanish conquerors will be granted the right to use a certain number of indigenous inhabitants to work the land, to mine ore from the mountains. In addition, the Spanish adapted some of the indigenous institutions. The Inca, specifically, used a system known as Mita. Mita was a labor tax. The Inca had a very elaborate system of developing census information so they could identify the size of populations of the villages and provinces that they conquered over time, and then they assessed obligations to those populations, depending on their size and composition, to work. This is how the great temples of the Inca Empire were built. This is how the roads were built, how wells were dug, how mines were worked. People were taxed on their labor. They would have to spend a certain number of days, weeks, months working on projects dictated by the Inca rulers. The Spanish combined both of these. Encomienda was used particularly in working the land, and then Mita was used especially in working the silver mines that became so central to the economic system of the Western Hemisphere. So we have essentially a merging of institutions, in both cases, institutions designed to employ the labor of the local population. However, there was one problem, and that was, of course, pandemic disease, the great dying that we saw. Remember, 90% of the indigenous population had died by 1650. It's a little difficult to go on building an economic system exploiting the labor of indigenous populations when the indigenous population is disappearing right before your eyes. One of the solutions to this was to adapt another Spanish institution to the New World, the Hacienda, a large landed estate that might encompass thousands upon thousands of acres. These were used specially for grazing purposes, cattle, sheep, although they might be used also simply for raising crops of various kinds. In part, these had arisen even before the demographic disaster began to take its full toll, because the Europeans were meat eaters. It's not that the indigenous populations, the Aztec, the Inca, it's not that they didn't eat any meat at all, but they never imagined eating the kinds of quantities of animal flesh that the Europeans ate. When they first saw the Europeans, they were kind of revolting to the local populations, because they would roast these huge pieces of flesh and then tear at them, and there'd be juices dripping down their beards and so forth. A very appealing sight. Those types of animals simply didn't exist in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. There were small animals, various forms of mammals, and of course fish were always available. But most of the food source depended upon grains and squashes, root vegetables, potatoes. That's where potatoes came from, the Andean region of South America. These were the basics of the diet of the population of the Americas. Now come the Spanish, and they need to be really fed. They eat, in terms of protein, animal protein, in a day, probably 10 times what the indigenous population would eat. So, in part, the haciendas were created to raise these kinds of animals to meet the needs of the Spanish population. So they had cattle, sheep, pigs, etc. But over time, it became not just a matter of meeting the dietary needs of the Spanish population. It also became a matter of how more efficiently to use the declining population to serve economic needs. A few Indians on a hacienda tending sheep, cattle, etc., could produce a great outpouring of caloric product to feed populations. This became another mechanism imported from Europe, used to adjust to changing conditions in the Americas. Another important development was the exploitation of mining resources in the Americas. Two great mining centers, one in South America, Potosi, the other in Mexico, Zacatecas, produced vast amounts of silver between the 16th and 18th centuries. Now, local populations had exploited silver and gold deposits long before the Spanish ever arrived. But silver and gold were not considered important commodities. For example, gold in the Inca Empire was used almost exclusively for religious purposes and for the adornment of the emperor and his family. These were not seen as forms of currency. This was not wealth to be bartered for, exchanged for, etc. But now, with the Spanish, of course, they've come with the idea that they're going to acquire something of great value, and that proves to be silver. Silver and gold, of course, in Europe and Asia is a critical medium of exchange. And here, the Spanish have hit upon two vast sites filled with silver ore. And they are going to begin extracting that material using, of course, the labor of the local population. Mule trains would then carry the boxes, the carts of silver out of the two great mining centers and towards two ports on the Caribbean: Vera Cruz in Mexico, Portobello in Panama. In the second half of the session, what we're going to do is look more closely at this, and I'll show you a map that shows the significance of these two sites. But the purpose of limiting it to two sites was control. The Spanish are creating a mercantilist system, which means simply a enclosed, self-contained trading network. Their purpose is to exploit the Americas to a maximum for the advantage of the mother country. To do that, they need to try to control trade. And the easiest way to do that was to ship goods out of the New World only through two ports. Even though the empire stretched for thousands of miles north and south of these two locations, everything had to come back to the center to be shipped to Spain. And on the other end, goods would be received and sent, and other goods sent back to the Americas only through two ports, Sevilla and Cadiz. So the idea of having two ports in the Western Hemisphere and just two ports in Spain handle all of the trade was simply to ensure that there would be tight control by the Spanish, and that they could exclude foreigners and exclude anyone whom they chose not to include in this trade. To further ensure this system, they created a fleet. The fleet, the naval fleet, would sail, well, it was supposed to sail twice a year. Sometimes it didn't sail at all. But the plan and the way the system functioned initially was to set the Great Fleet out to the New World to visit Veracruz and Portobello, to bring back the silver and deliver goods, basic manufactured goods like glass and hardware, and protect that fleet from foreign attack, and ensure that other merchant vessels without authorization from the crown did not sail in this network. We saw last time with the Portuguese how they tried to create their own version of a closed system with the trade in spices. Well, now the Spanish are doing this with somewhat more success, partly because the distances are much shorter, and also because they actually physically control the source of their valuable cargo, silver. The Portuguese, of course, don't control the Spice Islands, often the ends of the Indian Ocean. Here, this is a somewhat more successful process, but it follows that pattern we saw with the Portuguese, which was contrary to the kinds of systems that the Ottomans and the Mughals had set up, where the state simply tries to tax the trade passing through its territories. Here, the state wanted to directly control the trade, not just tax it. This was the purpose of this entire system, where you have a controlled trading network. And of course, what this leads to is that the crown dictates what the price of silver will be. And of course, the crown, through large merchants, dictates what products, how many products, and naturally, from that, what price those products will bear, are shipped to the New World. And all of this is done to the advantage of the imperial system. The idea is to extract wealth out of the New World, not to send wealth to it. So the residents of the New World are going to pay top dollar for the goods coming from Spain, and they're going to be given minimal prices for silver. The whole idea is the dynasty will ultimately benefit from these purposely uneven exchanges. Now, I said that the crown arranged these shipments through large merchants, more specifically through merchant guilds. These were, if you will, professional organizations of merchants. In this case, these types of guilds would be some of the leading merchant houses of Spain. And they would be involved especially in long-distance trade. These would be the same kinds of houses that would have been handling the trade through the Mediterranean, what we talked about when we discussed the Ottomans and Spain fighting over the Mediterranean. Guilds, and it wasn't just merchant guilds in this era, this is still the early modern world. We have guilds also among artisans, among skilled workers, and a guild really controls the economic activities of its members. It helps set prices, determines what cargoes are going to be handled. So the guild helps create a fixed kind of system. This is not going to be an open free market economy, as you can well imagine from what I already said about the trading network. The guilds are very much part of this kind of system, and they fit very well into the mercantilist plans of the Spanish. Create a control system and ensure that that control system, of course, works to the benefit of the mother country. This is part of a larger reality of Europe and much of the world at this time. We're talking about an economy of limited goods. In the modern world, we think of economies as simply unlimited in their potential expansion. We trace every year the growth of national product in this country, that country, and we assume that the potential for economic growth, for the production of goods, services, whatever, is simply unlimited. Just a matter of how many resources do we apply to particular areas of economic activity. This was not the mentality of the early modern world. We're talking about a mentality shaped in part by capitalism in the modern world. In the early modern world, there was still a belief that there were a limited set of goods in the world. And in terms of states, it was up to individual states to see how many of those limited goods they could acquire. So it's not a matter of, oh, well, we exchange goods and we build our own economies and everyone prospers. Well, not necessarily. Not in this vision. That kind of potential just isn't imagined at this time. So mercantilism makes sense with that kind of worldview, that there are only so many goods that can be produced. The more of them that we control, the fewer goods others will control. Helps explain these enormous battles over controlling of trade networks. It's not like everyone's going to share and we'll all grow prosperous together. It's not going to happen. That was also the worldview of the guilds, merchants, artisans. That's why they controlled the production of their members. But they also had a larger view. It wasn't just, well, gee, there are only so many goods that can be produced. There was also a view that this was a way of life that had intrinsic value and that led to the production of quality products. That these people, whether they're artisans or merchants, have special skills and are preserving a distinctive way of life. It isn't just a matter of controlling prices, it's a matter of ensuring the quality of products as well. That these are precious goods because we do live in a world of scarcity, and therefore what we create must be of the very best quality. At the same time, ideas about price were very different than the ideas that we have about price. This is, in the early modern world, not exactly Walmart Incorporated. It's not the idea that, look, we can offer you these goods at lower prices, and we'll even slash the lower price that we just offered you, because we're going to make available to as many people as possible goods at lower prices. And of course, we realize that all of this is driven by the market, by competition. Went out and bought an HD TV 2 years ago. You're crying now because you're looking at the same thing for a third of the price. Competition, driving down those prices. That concept of competitive pricing, competition in the marketplace simply was not a central concept of societies in the West. The idea was a just price. The price that is set by a guild serves two purposes. One, it provides the producer or the merchant with a decent living. And two, it's a reasonable price to offer the product at to a consumer. We're not gouging you. We're not overcharging you. Even if there's scarcity, you know, if there's an unusual scarcity at this time, this year we haven't produced as many goods, or the products coming from long distance trade are fewer in number, we're going to maintain prices at a reasonable level. What we want to ensure is a reasonable lifestyle, an adequate lifestyle, adequate support, and at the same time, a price that is within the range of affordability for those who would normally consume this good. And of course that varies depending upon whether you're talking about exotic silks or simple woven cloth. That was the world that the Spanish Empire reflected in its mercantilist system, its control of trade. But the Spanish Empire itself was, without knowing it, working aggressively to undermine all of this. That silver that was flowing from the Americas was like fuel being fed into the world economy. It was going to start the engines of change and accelerate their pace of operation relentlessly over the next few centuries. Now, we're not going to get into a lot of the detail of this today because I'm going to talk about it in the second half of this session. But what's referred to as the price revolution of this era, which started no later than the end of the 16th century, no later than the 1500s, and stretched all the way into the 18th century, was what we call inflation. That the prices of goods were going to start going up. All this silver flowing in to the European economies had the same effect as if the governments of Europe all decided, talking in the contemporary era, decided to start printing 2, 3, 4 times as much currency as they normally used. So they're feeding vast amounts of cash into the economy. And what that does is it starts prices going up. When people have more money in their hand, they're going to go out and bid up the price of goods. If, and this is a stretch to say the least, if I gave each of you $150,000, yeah, right. But if I could give you each $150,000 and say, look, in the next 48 hours, I want you to go out and you can keep this money, but only if you buy a red Lexus with a particular model number. And you have to buy it somewhere within Beltway 8. So now you've all got this money and you're all running after a limited number of goods because there are only so many red Lexuses of any model type inside the Beltway. So suddenly the price of a Lexus, a red Lexus, is going to start to shoot skyward because you people are going to start 50,000, 60, 70, 80 because I get to keep it. That's the same thing that's happening on a much vaster scale and over the course of centuries in Europe as silver flows in from the Western Hemisphere and money, cash, arrives in people's hands and they begin bidding up the price of goods. This was a distinct historical moment. Prices, as far as we can tell, and of course economic history is not exactly very precise about things that were going on back during the time of the Roman Empire or the period immediately after its collapse, the ancient world in general, but the idea of prices going up to any significant degree over a series of years, decades, etc., that just hadn't been an experience of people in the centuries preceding the discovery of the Americas. And suddenly it became an important issue. And it set off, as we will see, all kinds of changes. I mean, how can the guilds continue fixing prices for goods when there's this push of inflation and people are bidding up the prices of goods? How are people going to respond to that? Do you produce more goods? What do people do who are collecting tribute from peasants? We saw how important that was in the pre-modern world. Well, what happens when they're collecting fixed rents, if you will, and suddenly the value of the rent is going down because, of course, you know, prices are going up. A dollar isn't a dollar anymore. If there's been 20% inflation in the last year, a dollar is only 80 cents. You have to adjust, you have to change. It's going to trigger all kinds of dramatic changes, not only in Europe, but in much of the world. Now, again, we're going to talk about some of the dramatic social and economic changes next time as we track the price revolution. But there are other changes going on that are being initiated in no small measure by the Spanish conquest of the Western Hemisphere. Another important one is the establishment of plantations in the Western Hemisphere. Now, I mentioned when we were talking about the Portuguese and how they extended their trading network into Africa in the 1400s, and that they came in search, in part, for slaves to man sugar plantations in the South Atlantic. So plantations per se were not a new institution or idea. The Romans in the ancient world had sugar plantations and other forms of plantations. And a plantation, again, is essentially an agricultural factory. It's a large parcel of land devoted to the production of usually a single product, and that product is destined for commercial production. In other words, to be sold off in a market. It means a plantation is highly specialized, just like a factory is. There are people there with very specific functions. Those who plant and harvest, those who refine the product, if it's sugar, for example. What was distinctive about plantations in the Americas is that they were so big and there were so many of them. Most of the Caribbean in the 200 years after the Spanish conquest was converted into a series of plantations. If you've vacationed in the Caribbean sometime and visited islands like Jamaica, or et cetera, and you say, oh, lush green fields and so on, they used to be entirely covered with forests. They're not anymore because the environment was radically changed in a couple of centuries as people cut down all the trees to fuel the sugar refineries and to construct lodging for the slaves being brought to the region. Brazil became a vast network of plantations, and other areas as well. Now, initially, in the Caribbean, the Spanish employed the local population, subjecting them essentially to the conditions of slaves. The indigenous inhabitants of Hispaniola, remember we talked about that island, but we also know from talking about the pandemic diseases that very quickly Hispaniola's population went from maybe 500,000 to essentially nobody. So the dying off created this huge labor gap. The need to man these sugar plantations, which were probably second only to the production of silver in economic importance to the Spanish. Even where the Great Dying didn't have the same dramatic impact. The fact is, local inhabitants were much more difficult to enslave. Why? Because they know the terrain. You enslave somebody locally, and if they can possibly do it, they're going to escape. And their advantage is that they know the area, and they can probably find refuge with local populations. So if you bring in people from across the ocean, people who have no knowledge of the terrain, who have no linguistic connections with the local territories and populations, it's going to be, sure, they'll run off, but their chances of surviving and their chances of not being recaptured are much lower. So the economic importance of production of sugar, and again, we're going to come back and look at this too in terms of what it means to create a modern commodity like sugar. But the importance of sugar and the dying off of local populations in the Western Hemisphere led to a massive transfer, forced migration of tens of thousands and then millions of Africans to the Western Hemisphere to serve on these plantations. By the 1780s, we're talking 50 to 90,000 Africans being taken every year in the Atlantic slave trade. And of course, many of them, at least a third or more, sometimes two-thirds, wouldn't even survive the voyage. So the shipment of vast numbers of human beings continued throughout the 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th centuries. One of the things that this does is it begins changing the balance of power in Africa. You can imagine the enormous disruptions to societies as the hunt for slaves goes on. How people flee in desperation. At the same time, what it also does is empower certain states, certain African states along the coast. Indeed, new state systems such as the Ashanti arise in the 18th century based on the fact that they served the needs of the European slave traders. So you have the coastal regions of Africa taking on the primary power in the region. When we talked about the civilizations of Africa in terms of the rise of trade in the pre-modern world, we talked about places like Mali. They were focused not on the ocean, but on the desert. There are connections to the desert trading routes that link them all the way to Asia. But now, that's switching out to the coast, to the Atlantic coast. The powerful states are along the Atlantic coast. They are those that cooperate with the European slave traders. One of the technologies that makes it possible for the Ashanti to establish themselves as a major force in Africa is their acquisition of weapons, guns, rifles, from the Europeans. This, of course, accelerates the violence in Africa as well, because people now have weapons at their command that are far more deadly than anything that had been employed in previous centuries. So major changes in power structures, in social stability, are occurring in Africa as a result of things that are happening in the Western Hemisphere in the Spanish Empire. In the Caribbean itself, the Caribbean islands are transformed from Amerindian, meaning Native American populations, to slave societies. When does it become a slave society? When a society that is more white than black becomes more black than white. In other words, when a majority of the population consists of African slaves, and that consistently happened What starts out as a few slaves being brought to work on small plantations, increasingly by the beginnings of the 18th century, what we have is one island after another, Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, where 60, 70% or more of the population may consist of African slaves. Something else that happens in this process, although this is not exclusively true of the slave trade in the Atlantic, is that while slavery had existed down through the centuries, you've seen that there were forms of clientelage that were essentially forms of slavery. In the past, slavery, which was practiced in Asia, Europe, Africa, slavery was not specifically linked to race. People enslaved each other. Ottomans enslaved Spaniards, Spaniards enslaved Ottomans, etc. But now, increasingly, there is an identity between race and slavery, that it is Africans who are slaves. And this is going to have a profound influence, as we will see, in the modern world, when race becomes a critical issue. And we think of, in some ways, race has become a preoccupation of contemporary society. But it wasn't even a subject centuries ago. One of the things that helped make it a subject was the vast expansion of the slave trade in these centuries. Something else that happens over time is that a new form of society emerges in the Caribbean. A society of people who are descendants of Africans, but who have also been westernized, Hispanicized by their living in the Caribbean under Spanish rule. We get the formation of Afro-Creole societies. And much of the Caribbean and even parts of Central America today could be characterized as Afro-Creole societies. People who often mix African religious rites with various forms of Christianity, cultural practices, festivals that have African origin with Western European Christian practices. We see this merging of cultures that occurs in part as a result of this forced migration of millions of Africans to the Western Hemisphere. So, in looking at the Spanish Empire in the New World, we're looking at one example of European expansion that began in the 15th and 16th centuries. We've traced some of this already by looking at a variety of trading empires, whether it's the Portuguese, the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, the Chinese. But now we're looking at, well, what are some of the impacts? What are some of the changes that are taking place because of this? This is part of this process of transition from the pre-modern to the early modern to modern society. By focusing in on Spain, we can see some of the specific changes. In the Americas, one of the obvious ones was, of course, the Great Dying, a radical demographic collapse that eliminated 90% of the population of the Western Hemisphere. And the creation, of course, of a complex imperial system. That system, as we have seen, imposed certain sets of European institutions on the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish crown, the Christian church, economic institutions, such as Encomienda, Hacienda, the emphasis on silver mining as a critical economic activity. But at the same time, despite the massive conversion of the population to Christianity, there remained important elements of the pre-Columbian societies, those societies that existed before Columbus came to the New World. They remained very much a vibrant part of this world that was emerging in the Western Hemisphere. We saw this particularly with religious syncretism, essentially the merging of indigenous religious beliefs with some of the practices and beliefs of Christianity. People preserving complex worldviews, such as the Inca, that allotted 3 different spheres of reality, one to the divine, one to their own world as they conceived of it, and one to the Spanish. That might intersect and affect each other, but also remained distinct entities. So the structures of the old indigenous empires were swept aside. But much of the culture of the Western Hemisphere remained, albeit adapted to, a new westernized, Europeanized environment. Besides the significant changes that occur in political administration and economic activity in the Americas, we see changes that also reach out to other parts of the globe. The trade in human beings, the slave trade, moving millions of people across the Atlantic to work the plantations of the Americas. That in turn has important consequences for Africa, with shifting levels of power, particularly the concentration of power among coastal states like the Ashanti. We see the rise in violence and social disruption in Africa as a result of the slave trade, the importation of European weaponry. We also have seen a new set of cultures arising in the Caribbean as the descendants of African slaves help form a new, we're going to call it hybrid culture, reflecting both their own African roots and those of the Hispanicized environment in which they live. Finally, there is this large issue of the economic system. What the Spanish brought to the New World was a mercantilist system, a closed trading system designed to benefit them, which very much reflected the realities of early modern Europe and many other societies in the world. A belief that would have been shared by the Ming Dynasty, by the Ottoman Sultans, that this is a world of limited economic opportunities. And control of an increased portion of the economic goods of the world means that the economic goods available to others will be diminished. So it's essential to accumulate within a closed system. And in that same environment, domestic economies functioning through systems like the guild institutions are designed to deal with essentially economies of scarcity, providing qualities, goods that possess real quality, while at the same time providing a reasonable living to their producers. But unintentionally, the Spanish have set off one of the mechanisms that's going to radically change that thinking and that world. As the silver of the New World flows into the Old World, it's going to set off inflation and set off dramatic changes in how people conduct economic activities. It's going to change social formations, where we can no longer speak simply of groups that represent patron-client systems or groups that represent kin group systems. Now social classes, including working classes, are going to emerge as the world begins to change in very dramatic ways, in no small part as a result of the price revolution triggered by Spanish silver. We'll pick up on those subjects next time in part 2, session 6.